How do the absolute I, the music of Igor Stravinsky, Jaques Ranciere, and the power to make distinctions resonate? What is the difference between modernism and modernity? And why does everything solid melt into air? These elements and questions compose today's topic, modernism. Welcome to Political Compositions, where we explore the last 250 years of political, social, and cultural philosophy. I am Jamie.
I'm Gijs.
And join us in confronting the foremost philosophers, movements, and ideas from past and present, which compose political philosophy today. So turn on, tune in, but don't drop out.
So, Jamie, what can we expect from today's episode?
Well, we will discuss why the modern is different from the ancient. We discuss key figures such as Rousseau, Hegel, and Marx, and the legacy of the French Revolution. It sounds like a lot, so why don't we start by making a classic move in philosophy and start with a distinction? Why don't we distinguish between two concepts that are often confused but refer to different things, modernity and modernism?
Distinctions. Philosophy cannot do without them, even though many philosophers believed that these distinctions are to be overcome, because in the end, everything is one. For instance, Hegel somewhat resentfully called this view held by his contemporary Schelling the night in which all cows are black.
So, meaning that if you don't have a perspective that acknowledges differences, then you don't see differences.
Something like that. Which is not a new dilemma, by the way. The question of whether all is one is in a way the first obsession of philosophy ever since ancient Greece. Think, for instance, of Parmenides, who according to tradition taught that thinking and being are the same, which Plato paraphrased in one of his dialogues as the idea that all existing things are expressions of a single substance. Everything is ultimately one.
And Schelling, who lived over 2,000 years later, was apparently inspired by this and thought that there was an absolute point in which this became clear. So a relation of identity between thinking and being, or form and content. And even better, this absolute point is you, what he called the absolute I.
Whoa, talk about hyper-individualism.
Well, Schelling was a German romantic living in the late 18th, early 19th century. But it is a strange individualism, if we can even call it that, because this absolute I is not specifically tied to one individual, but is actually part of a larger process in which we're all involved. The concept of the absolute I is a name for the insight that ultimately all being and thinking are connected. Or, as we can put it, being and thinking are both expressions of the same thing, what we philosophically call the same substance.
But Hegel says that this just erases all differences.
So philosophy for Hegel is about making these differences, about being able to differentiate between this or that, and make a judgment on what this means, and then act on that insight. Otherwise, we would not be able to see the forest for the trees anymore.
In a double sense even. So both being able to observe details and specifics, but without forgoing the insight that all is one indeed. Hegel agrees that the world is one, but not directly to us. We don't experience the world as one, because we use language to try and understand it. And it is through our grasping of the world, of trying to think about the world, that we are able to make distinctions in speech or language.
And language is the expression of thought, or, as we will discuss in another episode regarding 20th century French philosophy, language is the structure of thought. By using language, we can name things or point them out, creating the difference between that thing and its background, or say an object and its context.
For Hegel, these distinctions only make sense if we ultimately come back to the idea of the one, to perceive and think through the distinctions that we ourselves make, and understand that they are related to each other.
Okay, but it seems strange to attribute making distinction to modernity then. I mean, if it is tied up in our capacity to think and speak, so to use language, which we did way before then already, right?
That's true. There is a Dutch professor of Hebrew and Bible studies, Ellen van Wolde, who interestingly claimed that the original 3 lines of the Bible, of Genesis, have been misinterpreted. Rather than saying, "In the beginning God created the heavens and the earth," she said the Hebrew verb bara doesn't mean create, but rather to distinguish. And by the way, there was no single beginning, but rather a start at some point.
So there was a point when God distinguished the heavens from the earth.
But we can take it even further, because in the New Testament book of John, first chapter, first verse, God is equated to the word, logos in Greek, meaning reason, speech, words spoken, and archai and hologos. In the beginning was speech. Hologos and prostonteon, the speech was close to God. Kaiteos en hologos, and God was speech. So much for the cliché, in the beginning was the word. So we can say that John's point was to alert us to the importance of language, of speech, and the almost divine power of language to make distinctions and thereby create the world, quite literally even.
All right. Well, that's interesting, although I guess we can never truly tell if the Bible attributed making distinctions to divine powers. Either way, we now mostly understand that language is not just a means to describe things, but is itself a creative act. I am still a little puzzled, though. What about modernity is so uniquely connected to difference, then?
It's about our experience and valuation of change, of difference. The world of the Bible doesn't really develop, so to speak, nor did the world of ancient Greece or even ancient Rome. More specifically, the thinking about the world in those times did not consider how the world was evolving or that life would be radically different in different periods of time.
And therefore, we haven't always thought of difference as something important, perhaps. And modernity is therefore the era in which we discover historical development.
According to Hegel, modernity is the moment in which we become aware of this power to make distinctions as our own power. We come to realize that the world is partially a product of our thinking, speaking, and doing, rather than assume it must be so by nature or by divine decree. This means that socially, culturally, and politically, the world becomes malleable.
Okay, in modernity, we become aware of the world as changeable by us. But we still haven't made a distinction between modernism and modernity. They are both derived from the word modern, which colloquially is used to refer to the present, right? When we say something is modern, we mean it is updated or contemporary. And I guess that makes sense for modernity.
For sure. However, there's something confusing in the use of the term modernity, as it is sometimes used in a broad sense and sometimes in a more narrow sense, historically speaking. In the broad sense, it refers to everything from the mid-17th century on, the time of, say, Descartes, Hobbes, and Spinoza.
Time which is usually referred to as early modernity.
And then the more restricted sense, mostly with reference to social and economic developments like industrialization, urbanization. This lets modernity start around the beginning of the 19th century.
Right. And then to complete the confusion, in an even broad sense, modernity can begin in the 16th century, the period of the Renaissance. So think of Michelangelo and Machiavelli, for starters.
In any case, the experience of being modern can be situated somewhere at the end of the 18th century. If you want to relate it to a specific philosopher, it would be Rousseau, who has been called the last of the ancients and the first of the moderns.
That pesky Rousseau again. But this bears some explanation. I mean, how can Rousseau be both the last of what would come before, the ancients, but also the first modern, that which comes after?
Well, Rousseau was considered a transitional figure around the end of the historical period of modernity. By then, modern came to stand for the practices, values, and attitudes that were developed in that period. Rousseau himself wrote about a man who was considered one of the moderns who had an ancient soul. This could have been a self-description.
Yes, Rousseau was quite modern in his political philosophy. In his work, The Social Contract, he himself makes a sharp distinction between ancient and modern societies. Ancient societies, for instance, did not have the type of legal systems or rights that we associate with modern societies. They were about the might of the strongest, but modern society was about legality and equality.
At the same time, Rousseau was not at all modern. He grew up in the city-state of Geneva and held on to the traditional values, or what he called mœurs, something like social morality, that he experienced there.
A city-state, so like Athens. But Geneva wasn't so ancient. I mean, the city-state of Geneva only came up in the Middle Ages, and it didn't really have any ancient history.
But Geneva modeled itself on the ancient city-states, so in that sense, it was ancient. By the time Rousseau lived there, so late 18th century, Geneva had been a relatively prosperous city-state for over 200 years. Yet everywhere around it, the world was rapidly changing under the new political and economic conditions, and the beginning of the first industrial revolution. Rousseau experienced that the pressures of these rapid developments led to a fading of the communal ties and social morality.
I guess that's why we shortly discussed him in the episode on Romanticism, right? Rousseau wrote books on the education of people like Émile. So these large-scale political and economic changes alienated people from their hometown values and relations, say the close-knit communities that you might still find in villages or smaller towns today. Rousseau wanted to develop a kind of public civil education that would help people overcome their alienation.
Rousseau thought that people were endowed with a tendency toward these types of communal ties and shared values. It was modern society that alienated people from their natural tendencies to be good and social. Modern man was in need of civic education and a fitting new civic religion.
Unfortunately for Rousseau, he died in 1778, about 10 years before the French Revolution kicks off, so he never got to see the supposed impact of his writings, or rather see that world unfold. Yet he is still connected to the revolution in some sense. I mean, one of the revolutionaries who led the charge, Maximilien Robespierre, is said to have quoted Rousseau on a daily basis.
Whoa.
However, what I still don't know now is, how is modernity different from modernism?
Nearly forgot. Modernism refers to a later movement in the 20th century, especially in art and philosophy, which reflects the experience of enlightened existence, as it is affected by industrialization, urbanization, technology, and, not to forget, war. Modernism doesn't reject enlightenment or progress. On the contrary, it sort of relentlessly presses on. It's a kind of pressure cooker that aims to make us feel the radical consequences of modernity. Think, for instance, of the Sacre du Printemps, the ballet by Diaghilev, dance by Nijinsky, and set to music by Igor Stravinsky, or Picasso's paintings, or in a very different way, Marcel Proust's À la recherche du temps perdu.
All right, so to kind of summarize this a little bit, modernism is a type of attitude or movement that sprung from modernity. So, to not lament the large-scale alienating societies, but instead understand, value, and even enjoy them instead. Fortunately, we'll have occasion to revisit modernism in another episode. However, the developments of modernity and the philosophical attempt to grasp them surely didn't end with Rousseau, did they?
Absolutely not. Things just started off there. Remember Hegel's expression, the night in which all cows are black, and this idea that distinctions matter for us to understand who we, as a human species, are, and what we aim to be or do. Hegel wrote this in the preface to one of his most famous works, the Phänomenologie des Geistes, Phenomenology of Spirit, which came out in 1807. When Hegel was writing this, the French Revolution had just led to revolutionary wars throughout Europe. As soon as the revolution started in France in 1789, other European nations, especially, of course, their royal families, were worried that their heads were next on the chopping block. So they decided to wage war against France. And in the tumultuous period that followed, it was Napoleon who eventually took power and took the war to the other European nations.
While crowning himself as emperor at some point.
Yes, perhaps unsurprisingly, Napoleon modeled himself on ancient Rome and the Roman emperors. Either way, Hegel had been in Jena for a few years as a privaatdocent, say university teacher who is paid directly by his students, a common occupation at that time. And it is said that the day after he finished the Phenomenology of Spirit, he could hear the sounds of Napoleon's cannons.
Ah, how poetic and probably not historically accurate at all.
Probably not. But we know that Napoleon did indeed pass through Jena, and that Hegel, who was an admirer of Napoleon initially, thought that he saw the world spirit on horseback.
Ah, the world spirit on horseback. That is quite a description, and maybe a little bit much to work through all of the philosophical meanings of world spirit. Does it suffice to assume here that Hegel thought of Napoleon as some kind of representative of the developments of modernity?
For now, sure, yes. Napoleon furthered some of the principles and systems that came out of the French Revolution, at least initially. Hence, he was seen as a modernizer. And you can still see this in the legal systems that Europe has today. Many of them were inspired by the legal system that Napoleon implemented in France in 1804. It is still the basis of the French legal system, and we know that system now as the Code Napoleon.
Speaking of Napoleon, now this might be a little bit of a detour, but it wasn't just in philosophy that this experience of modernity was felt, right? It is said that Beethoven's Third Symphony was originally written as praise for Napoleon.
It was, until Beethoven learned about the violence in Napoleon's excursions and his desire to wield more power himself. The Third Symphony was a milestone in classical music, and, like the French Revolution, a break with tradition. Beethoven idolized Mozart, but thought that his classical style was over, never to return. We may experience the Third Symphony as beautiful, but at the time, it will also have sounded harsh and forbidding, relentless. Just listen to those two opening quarter notes, or crotchets, as they're called. They're like hammer blows, or a gun salute maybe. There's a political, militant, and perhaps even military force to it. He named it the Eroica, or Heroic Symphony.
Right, and it is said that originally the piece was dedicated to Napoleon. But when Beethoven heard that he had crowned himself emperor in 1804, he threw a fit and renamed it Eroica, meaning it's more about the spirit than about the man. Napoleon betrayed that spirit. He was not loyal to the cause. Going back to being emperor betrayed the French Revolution and the modern political principles Napoleon supposedly helped bring into the world.
And the French Revolution is important because it is the political moment in which people broke with tradition and wanted to rearrange society on a rational basis. Feudal society, which attributed people's rightful places and powers as if by natural or divine right, concentrated power into the hands of the king, his nobility, and maybe some clergy. But the people at large had no say in public matters.
So a little bit like how Louis XIV called himself the Sun King.
Louis XIV, yes.
Born into his role as king, but legitimated by divine right to rule. By the way, it was his great-grandson, Louis XVI, that was beheaded during the revolution. So we can understand how if the revolution becomes synonymous with breaking with the past, with starting society anew on a rational basis, and trying to gain political equality, installing yourself as emperor doesn't feel very modern.
Right. It's even the case that the French Revolution gave us this idea of a revolution as a process of breaking with the past. The word revolution actually comes from the Latin revolvere, meaning to roll back. So before then, revolutions were about going back to the origins and forgetting all the unnecessary additions that came into play later on. It was about going back to the original or core principles.
That is until the French Revolution, and they went quite far with trying to remodel society on a rational basis. They even set up a wholly new calendar system, the French Republican calendar.
Good idea. Really start over again. Also to get rid of the oddities of our calendar. No leap years.
Right, if only. But they kept the leap years to match the solar year. But everything else, they tried to set up in decimal ratios. So in numbers of 10. 10 months divided into 10-day cycles for weeks. Each day had 10 hours, and each hour had 100 minutes, and each minute had 100 seconds. And the years were...
Also multitudes of 10?
No, Roman numerals. And the names were made up with references to seasonal phenomena. So like the Brumaire and Thermidor. I'll be honest, though, I only know those two from Karl Marx's writings.
I thought so.
He famously had them in book titles. So, Brumaire is supposedly the second month of autumn, neologism referring to mist, actually, and Thermidor is the second month of summer, referring to the Greek word for heat, thermon. But you may be forgiven for not knowing much about this calendar. It lasted less than 2 years and never really caught on.
And it's also hard to get rid of a system that is so tied in with the tide and the rhythms of nature, so to speak, days and nights, weeks, months, years, and perhaps also with the more cultural nature of man. Although we are here getting into the more contested area of philosophical anthropology, and the philosophers like Hegel, who attempted to construct not only a phenomenology, as we mentioned, but also a political philosophy around such an idea of philosophical anthropology, and what you might call its internal logic, the unfolding of some logic that is inherent in the relation of man to nature, and how man conceives of nature in his thought.
I guess we have sort of stumbled on how Hegel thinks political philosophy, and moreover critique, should work. And, in a larger sense, how dialectical development should work, as the internal logic that can be grasped by us and is then used to check and reflect on the practice, which propels it forward, as it were.
As is proper to dialectics.
Since we are back on the topic of Hegel, he too saw rapid developments in his hometown. He was born in Stuttgart, a decently sized town from the Duchy of Württemberg, one of many member states in the Holy Roman Empire. Quite a conservative town, however, in what is now Germany. These states were constantly at war with each other for all sorts of reasons. It was a crazy time. The rules for politics and social norms kept changing, like freedom of speech, or whether the local university should even be funded. So the center of intellectual gravity kept shifting. For instance, in the 1790s, Jena was the intellectual center. But by the time Hegel got there around 1800, it was already in decline. And by the time he left, it was over. Along the way, he needed to keep up to date on the other states, the status of Napoleon's battles, news from England, and so on. The question is, how was he able to?
Throughout his life, Hegel was an avid newspaper reader, and he especially liked the French dispatches. He even worked for a newspaper for a while in Bamberg, about which he said he wanted it to have the modern French and international values, but with a German love for truth and work ethic.
Of course, he couldn't totally leave his Germanness behind him, both in his philosophy and his penchant for newspaper reading.
At one point, when in Jena, Hegel wrote down in his so-called scrapbook, so sort of diary notebook, Das Zeitungslesen des Morgens früh ist eine Art von realistischem Morgensegen. Man orientiert seine Haltung gegen die Welt an Gott oder an dem, was die Welt ist. Jenes gibt dieselbe Sicherheit wie hier, dass man wisse, wie man dran sei.
All right, that's a lot of German, but loosely translated, reading a newspaper is like a morning prayer in that you orient yourself in the world.
The point being that before modernity, you could understand your place in the world by reading the Bible. You would know what humanity's place in the natural order is, between animals, which are lower, and then God or angels at the higher end. And of course, the moral messages that the Bible contains would guide you. However, the word of the Bible is static. It doesn't change, and your place is always the same. But the modern world, once it discovered difference and change, never stops changing. We are caught up in this whirlwind of change. It becomes a whole new challenge to get one's bearings, to understand who and what you are, and what's up, so to speak.
So reading the morning newspaper is learning about how the world is different today than it was, say, yesterday?
That's the whole reason newspapers exist. And the reason you can throw them away the next day. Yesterday's newspaper is for wrapping up fish.
Even though the newspaper is a German invention, right? I mean, they had the printing press capabilities, and around the 17th century, we see the first newspapers arise. But the real boom, I imagine, occurs in the early 19th century, especially in Germany and, of course, the United States.
Yeah, the New York Times was founded in the mid-19th century. all the news that's fit to print, as they proudly proclaimed.
Right. Unfortunately, Hegel wasn't around for that. He died in 1831 in Berlin, as by then the most prominent philosophy professor in the German-speaking states. So he did not live to see all of the consequences of the modernization process that were in full swing throughout his life, but perhaps we are still seeing them develop today even.
But his most famous student, Karl Marx, did get to experience and think through some of these consequences. Marx was an enthusiastic reader of Hegel, and in this way a student, but he never actually studied under Hegel, nor did Marx ever meet Hegel. Especially early on, Marx wrote several books and commentaries on Hegel's philosophy, and even up until the end of his life, he mentions Hegel in his works.
And we get one of the best descriptions of modernity from Marx, right? All that is solid melts into air.
Yeah, except this is a little bit of a poetic rendering of Marx's German, which says, alles Ständische und Stehende verdampft. So the German has a more direct reference to the evaporation or disappearance of everything that stands, either physically or socially, such as estates or standings. Modernity is the force that does away with all natural distinctions, all the traditional or religious distinctions, but also the traditional ways of life that were connected to these distinctions. They no longer hold in modernity.
And that's why Jaques Ranciere says that our experience from then on is formed by the dissolution of the markers of certainty. In the early 19th century, all the old certainties of, well, sometimes hundreds of years of tradition, all of a sudden collapse or are displaced. The upshot being that there is a new and maybe freer world in which democracy can emerge, even if slowly. And the downside being that we have no orientation anymore. At least, and maybe we can edit Hegel a little, the morning newspaper is like a morning prayer, except it doesn't bring you the same certainty. Or even worse, no certainty whatsoever. We desperately try to find our place through the newspapers, only to find out that we don't have one.
And to make matters worse, in the same section, Marx talks about how this fading away of the old structures, habits, and traditions is admirable to a certain extent, but also leaves us more vulnerable. And indeed, as Marx notes throughout his time, a new social distinction comes up, only now one we created ourselves, that of the bourgeoisie, the factory owner, versus the proletariat, the factory workers.
Let's leave that for a later episode, though. It seems like one of Pandora's other boxes might open then.
Yes, back to the statement. While it may be a little bit of a poetic translation of Marx's more precise German, there is a great book from some 40 years ago by American philosopher Marshall Berman with the title All That Is Solid Melts into Air, The Experience of Modernity. It's about understanding what it means to be a modern subject, an emancipated citizen and a human being that has to live a decent and dignified life, knowing full well that the world is in turmoil continuously. To be a modernist, he said, is not just about the experience of personal and social life in continuous disintegration and renewal, but to make oneself somehow at home in the maelstrom, to make its rhythms one's own, to move within its currents in search of the forms of reality, of beauty, of freedom, of justice, that its fervid and perilous flow allows.
Wow, that's quite poetic. In a way, then, modernism never ended for Berman. Life is still about making yourself at home in a world that is continuously changing, and maybe now even faster than ever, right?
Yes, while Berman starts with Goethe's poetic writings, so around the late 18th century, he also goes on to discuss Marx, but continues on to the artistic practices of the 19th century as well. Famously, French poet and aesthete Charles Baudelaire both exemplified and argued for what he called the flaneur and his close cousin, the dandy, a high-minded and self-styled citizen who wanders the streets of industrial society, donning the newest fashion and admiring the beauty of industrial society.
Industrial society. So even if the thick smokestacks of coal-burning furnaces leave black soot all over town, we must stop to admire and take it all in. We must see the aesthetic beauty in even the most miserable of colors and the accompanying dire public health systems.
Something like that, but maybe not quite, if only because the dandy was very particular about his clothes. Foucault, who also discussed Baudelaire, argued that it fits with the modernist attitude of wanting to break with the past. So, we must understand Baudelaire in contrast to painters and artists of that time who were still hung up on the ancient world, painting contemporaries with ancient gowns, rather than the 19th century fashion which they thought was too ugly. Instead, Baudelaire showed us how the supposedly ugly fashion of that time with lots of greys and blacks was, in the words of Foucault, the necessary costume of our time.
I also believe that there was somewhat of a difference of opinion between Berman and Foucault, right?
Yes, so Foucault is ultimately considered a postmodernist, although no one is really happy with that label, Foucault and myself included. But Foucault felt modernism was great but finished, and the real lessons taken from modernism concern the specific attitude that you have to take up, a philosophical ethos that he described as a permanent critique of our historical era.
Okay, and Berman remained then more of a modernist.
For sure, for Berman, modernity has been marked by rapid changes since the 1800s, and our experience today is still marked by these changes. In the final sections of his book, he even turns to the modernism of New York in the 1960s and 1970s, his hometown.
Right, I think I even remember seeing a picture of him at Occupy Wall Street wearing a shirt supporting the protest movement against the power of financial elites.
Yeah, Berman remained a committed Marxist throughout his life. And perhaps the real difference is in ambition or maybe in expectation. For Foucault, life after the rupture of modernity is about self-styling, about making your life out of nothing, like an artwork basically. Marshall Berman kept faith in some kind of collective ability of modern subjects to not only confront the world, but to make ourselves at home in the world.
Even if the modern homes, streets, and spirits go on melting into air?
Even then.
This podcast was made possible by the Erasmus School of Philosophy and the Center for Learning and Innovation at the Erasmus University Rotterdam. A special mention goes out to Mirjam Fuselier and Sun Liu. Thank you, Sam Vitikainen, for the beautiful opening and closing theme. Daniel Nolet for his expert mastering. And thanks to Ludo de Bo for his insights and guidance in this project. Finally, we would like to thank our editor extraordinaire, Max Wassink.